Hey, pal!
Yeah?
Let me ask you something. Would you protect your home from termites?
Yeah?
Would you protect your home from intruders?
Yeah.
Well, then why the hell are you not protecting your home from UFOs?
What do you mean?
I tell you what I mean. Right now, the number one concern in the state of New Jersey is UFOs.
Yeah?
Yeah! So head on down to Wayne's Paranormal Emporium and Pool Supplies, where we got everything you need to keep those pesky flying saucers out of your hair and out of your business. Because let's be real, you don't want these guys knowing about you.
You don't want them.
You don't want these little green men knowing shit about you. They know. Let me tell you something. Uncle Sam's already breathing it down your neck, right? He knows you haven't paid taxes in a few years.
He's right there. He's over your shoulder.
He knows. He's just like King George. You know what I mean? He's taking that money every year. So what? You tried to hold some back for you and yours. Why, does that make you a bad guy? No, it doesn't make you a bad guy.
You're not a bad guy.
Just because you're on a no-flight list doesn't mean you gotta let your home be overtaken by UFOs. Why, here, just listen to one of our very own satisfied customers.
Well, I had these UFOs in my yard every night for a month. I didn't know what to do, so I went down to Wayne's. He treated me right. He fixed me up. Plus, he got me some chlorine for the pool while I was there.
That's right, folks. Don't leave you and yours at the risk of being just another scientific experiment for these Martian wackos. Let me tell you, in the Red Bank area alone, we have serviced over 35 happy families. Because what's yours should stay yours and nobody else's. Because let's be honest, they're coming for what you got.
They want it.
They're coming for what you got. You know, these drones over New Jersey, let me tell you something. I know why they're here. I know why they're here. Yeah, we all do. I think you know. Come on. Come on, you're a little scumbag, aren't you? You're a little scumbag, aren't you? You know what I'm talking about. Come on. Oh, you think you're all big shit now, huh? You think you're big shit that you moved to the city?
You ain't big shit.
You're wearing your Nikes, you got your Starbucks. You think no one can touch you, huh? You think no one can fuck with you now that you're hot shit? Well, let me tell you something. They can fuck with you. They can bend you over a barrel and fuck you. They don't care. They don't care. They don't abide by our laws. You understand me, you son of a bitch? Fucking understand me?
Listen to this man.
You understand?
He's trying to help you.
I'm trying to help you out, man. What are you doing? And that's why at Wayne's Paranormal Emporium and Pool Supplies, we got everything you need to keep E.T.O.U.T. out of your property. And that is a Wayne's Paranormal Emporium and Pool Supplies promise. Plus, we'll clean your pool. UFO Invasion, Spain, 1968, Volume 2. In spring of 68, 4 young girls in the Palmar de Troya area of Andalusia, Spain, set out for a simple afternoon of picking wildflowers. Among them was a witness named Ana Garcia Gonzalez, and she would see something that turned their day of flower picking into the talk of the town. So while these girls are wandering the fields picking flowers, Ana notices some movement behind a nearby bush. Naturally, the girls are curious, because why wouldn't you be, right? But what they found wasn't your average woodland creature. It was something far more extraordinary. As they approached, they were met with the vision of a human-like figure. And the closer they got, the details became even stranger. This figure was that of a stunning, almost otherworldly woman. She had a round, pink face, large, mesmerizing black eyes, all framed by a brown mantle. Her presence was described as ethereal, almost glowing. Once again, I'm getting angel-like vibes in a way. The girls are so struck by the sight of this thing that when the story hit the media, it spread like wildfire. Soon crowds were flocking to the area, convinced that these girls had been visited by none other than the Holy Virgin herself, Mary. Now, let's unpack this. How many stories so far has there been a sort of divine inclination or something that seems to be at least imitating the divine? Once again, that doesn't really, could this have been if we're talking from spiritual or paranormal aspect, a demonic something imitating?
A perceived idea, even. It sounds like they mimic not only what they think will appear human.
Right.
But what they think will appear familiar to a human.
Exactly. Even if it's only an idea in concept, like that of angel. Obviously, people have said they've seen angels, and obviously, who knows, they may very well may have. But even for those who haven't seen a quote-unquote angel, we all have a conception of what that is. A sort of general, and it might vary a little bit, but we all have a sort of template in our minds, something beautiful, glow, wings. I don't know where the wings came from in history. Obviously, especially during the medieval era, things were added on by the church, the Catholic Church, or just from various other cultures that they absorbed, these accoutrements that we now, like the idea of halos, all that stuff. But yeah, for the most part, this in general seems to, so far, be something that is or is imitating an angelic being. And if this happens in a religious community, it might strike wildfire, like when people think they see Mary on a piece of toast or something like that. So suddenly, if you are in a place that is very religious or whatnot, it's no surprise that these girls and their community might think they see the Virgin Mary, especially if it's, a more Catholic-centered place. I mean, that makes total sense why their minds would go to that, whether that's what it was or not. So is this something from another dimension, or is it something that no matter what its true form is, maybe almost like a cloak, whatever its exterior is meant to, depending on the eye of the observer beholding it, will take on the form of something it thinks is pleasing to that person. So if you're very religious, you might see an angel or Mary or God, Jesus or whatever your religion is, whatever the equivalent is. Or if it thinks you're a lustful person, it might be a sexy person. Maybe it's something that, depending on our wants or how we were raised, it might be in the room with two people and two people see very different things because it's portraying whatever it thinks that specific individual wants to see.
That would almost imply that it's transmitting the experience directly to the person's brain.
Right.
That it's not a physical manifestation of whatever it is they're projecting, but it is a mental thing. They're able to transmit to the mind of the observer.
Yes. And that obviously does not mean that it's all in that person's head, that they're imagining it. We say that all the time on Creep Street, but it might just mean that these things maybe are in a form we can't comprehend. Maybe they operate on a certain bandwidth we cannot see, just how there's certain colors of the spectrum we can't see with the naked eye. Maybe they exist in a certain spectrum we can't see, so it presents something that we can see or something. Or that it can then transmit to each individual what it wants them to see, or to just a mass of people one thing, but either way it's transmitting images. So like we always say, just because it's all in your head doesn't mean it's not real. And there's also the idea of a tulpa, a thought form. If we believe in something enough collectively, our collective belief brings it to life. And I always make the same joke, but on Creep Street we always say, like, well, if that's true, why doesn't Santa exist? Well, maybe it's because we're not afraid of Santa. If Santa's real, no one's going to kill you, but if these other things that we fear are real, things that could actually kill you, we have more belief in them because we need to have belief, even if they aren't real, because if they are,
they're a threat.
Whereas something like a Santa Claus, well, even if it's real, you're fine. So like your mind automatically puts more stock in things it fears. It's playing its bet safe.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that is automatically assumed a threat as opposed to something that's not automatically assumed a threat by a human being.
Exactly. Right. So there's beliefs, so like examples like Slender Man. Was Slender Man something that started, as we know, as an online thing? It started like in Reddit or like No Sleep or whatever. Is now become many people every year claim to have had encounters with this Slender Man entity. There was even a documentary about those girls that tried to kill their friends. It's on HBO. It's called Beware the Slender Man, but it's a true crime story about these girls that tried to kill their classmate, claiming the Slender Man made them do it. Or luckily that girl survived. But things like that. Does our collective belief in these things bring them to life? Now, March 1968, spring, yet again. An unnamed witness was out for a peaceful nighttime stroll near the ruins of an old deserted castle in St. Vincent de San Sierra in La Rioja, Spain. The night was still and the air was heavy with an almost unnatural calm, the witness said. It's the kind of calm where you start to get a little spooked, right? You start to sound a little more menacing. You start to think you see things in the corner of your eye. That's sort of quiet. But in this case, the things moving in the shadows weren't just tricks of the eye. The witness decided to rest in one of the castle's patio areas, and the moonlight on the ruined walls created a sort of otherworldly ambience. And as the quiet of the night crept in, our witness began to drift into a sleepy stupor. But just as they were about to fall asleep, the clock struck midnight, and the witness snapped awake. And what he saw terrified him. Standing just 10 meters away were 3 massive humanoid figures. These weren't just tall people, though. These beings had incredibly broad shoulders. Their forms were entirely cloaked in black hoods that extended down to the ground. If that wasn't unsettling enough, each figure was clutching what appeared to be a scythe, much like your typical Grim Reaper. Oh, but it gets worse. All 3 of these ghostly intruders had, quote, large, round, red eyes that stared directly at the witness. And in a truly unnerving twist, those eyes seemed to blink in unison, as if choreographed or programmed by something or someone. Well, overwhelmed by fear, the witness did what any of us would do and ran like hell. They fled into a nearby grape vineyard and stayed hidden there until dawn, too terrified to even look back. But when morning finally broke, the 3 hooded figures had vanished, leaving only the witness trembling in the vineyard. And the question is, what were they? Now, here we have the opposite side of the spectrum. This is something you would associate with more demonic or spooky, bad, essentially malevolent forces. But once again, almost like a giveaway, what's with the eyes blinking in unison? Blinking in unison would seem to indicate that they're almost automation in a way. That they're almost like
synchronicity of it kind of implies a mechanical nature to it.
Oh, right. Or like
not natural.
Right. But in a way that's almost, but also not, doesn't scream paranormal.
Screams technological.
In a weird way, right? Like it's almost like screensavers. Like it's so maybe this thing was trying to pretend to be scary, or like almost like how in Scooby-Doo it's always someone trying to scare people away from gold or something. Like it's like almost like if there was something you wanted to keep hidden within the ruins of this castle, you might have a projector or something that imitates to scare people away, but it's actually a facade, or it's not actually that threatening or something, or who knows, maybe it's as threatening as it sounds. But the whole thing of eyes blinking in unison makes me think like it sounds like something, because think about how to the T this thing is of a black robe with a scythe. I mean, what's more, when you think of the Grim Reaper, you think of death. I mean, we all kind of have a template, but once again, it's like...
Yeah, I mean, scythe on its own is so synonymous with the Grim Reaper. It's almost a symbol of death on its own.
Right. I mean, one, a scythe on its own is threatening just because it looks scary as hell and can hurt you, but also the notion of harvesting souls, it's the metaphor of the scythe, But yeah, it seems like, once again, here we are getting presented with something that seems right out of a old Gothic horror book from, like a 19th century story. It's like, it's the most base take on the Grim Reaper you can have, or the most basic take, I guess you could say, on the Grim Reaper that you could have.
It's almost cliche. Like, it makes,
right.
If I woke up and saw that, I'd roll my eyes a little bit. Like, oh, guys, can't you be a little more creative with your scare tactics?
Exactly.
Come on.
It's almost cliche to the point where it's like, and then the blinking in unison, not that I guess supernatural creatures couldn't do that, but yeah, it does seem to betray something either mechanical or technological or something. Yeah, it's
calculated.
It's
at
calculated.
The very least.
Right. Like, even if it's maybe it's just one supernatural being that's projecting itself as three to be more intimidating. But you would think, why would it need to be more intimidating? It's a supernatural entity with a scythe. Well, summer of 68, things kept chugging along. There in the small town of Palmar de Troya in Utrera, Andalusia, Spain, the folks were abuzz with more reports of the Virgin Mary. A young man, curious about these divine apparitions, ventured to an area with his family, joining a crowd of onlookers drawn by these stories that were hoping to get a glimpse of the Virgin Mary for themselves. The group gathered on a quiet hillside where previous sightings had been reported, and the atmosphere was hushed with anticipation. As night fell, the scene became thick with a sense of expectancy. And according to the report from our source from Rosales, this young man who was there with his family wasn't just an observer that night, but became part of the dang show. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. Witnesses described a palpable change in the energy. And then it happened. A glowing figure emerged from the darkness. This apparition was described as a radiant woman. Her form both solid yet surreal, clad in what appeared to be luminous robes. Many in the group were convinced they were witnessing the Virgin Mary herself. Some reportedly fell to their knees in prayer, tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed by the sheer power of the moment. But here's where it takes a turn for the even more bizarre. While the group interpreted the vision as divine, the young man reported feeling a strange, almost magnetic pull towards this entity. He later claimed that the glowing woman locked eyes with him, and he was filled with an unshakable mix of awe and unease. And the figure just vanished, leaving the group to wonder what they had just experienced. So, let's talk about this area where in 1968, people could, with, I guess, some regularity, you couldn't maybe tune your clock to it, but with some sort of regularity, there was an entity showing up at a certain spot. This would almost, to me, imply something. I mean, yeah, you hear about UFOs being drawn to a certain spot, especially if there is a point of interest, but that's usually more with craft because they're interested in a nuclear power station or a military base, or they're coming out of, if you're to believe that they're coming from the earth, maybe they're shooting out of a certain area from a mountain, like a cave mouth or something. Typically, you don't typically hear of of like actual alien beings like revisiting a place over and over, although you do, but it's more to do with the people, like someone who is regularly abducted rather than a location. But when it comes to ghosts or supernatural entities, we obviously are very familiar with the notion of residual hauntings. The example I always give, in Chicago, there's the alley by the Biograph Theater where they say you can, with regularity, see the ghost of John Dillinger running down the alley where he was shot, and then at the end of the alley, he'll fall and vanish. And it's like with somewhat regularity, people say you can see the ghost of John Dillinger. So it's like, well, what would with somewhat regularity be showing up at this hillside in that form? Now, this one person claims they made eye contact with the person. Who knows? I'm sure many people, though, especially if it's a divine person, probably felt, oh, Mary looked at me, Mary. And maybe if you are the Virgin Mary, maybe that is the effect you want to have. I would think if you were a religious entity in that way, you would probably want people there to feel as though they had a personal experience, like, so they walk away with a feeling of so-and-so loves me, whether it's God or Mary or something. So that part's interesting, but this one's a little harder to say because this one sounds more, I would say, sounds more in the supernatural bucket, or at least...
Yeah, it could be. The one thing that strikes me, the repeated nature of it, right? That this was a, like you said, almost to the time, almost suggests that whatever it is has a motivation, has a goal that it hasn't yet accomplished.
Right.
Why else would anybody do the same thing over and over again, show up to the same place over and over?
Right.
It implies that there's unfinished business.
Right, exactly.
So whatever that may mean, it could suggest a lot of things, I suppose. It doesn't necessarily mean extraterrestrials, although that's kind of what I'm leaning toward, just because what if they are trying to obtain a particular person or accomplish a particular event?
Right.
For lack of a better word?
Well, there's also a theory that some of these, if they are interdimensional, that they feed. So like, for example, a very common thing we talk about is the Hat Man, which is associated with sleep paralysis. And there's a theory that shadow people, whatnot, are these things that are essentially feeding off of your negative energy. If you are afraid, it's like they're getting a snack and then you kind of wake up fully and they're gone, or you're able to then start moving and they're gone. It's like they're getting a snack. Well, maybe this is something that wants that other side of the spectrum, that wants those good feelings, and maybe it's showing up, presenting itself as this angelic being so that it can then, it's snacking on the good things that the love and adoration and hopes that people have that they would associate with a person like the Virgin Mary or something. You know what I mean? Like it's feeding, whether it's supernatural or extraterrestrial, maybe interdimensional. It's like it's getting a snack in a way. It's feeding off of that energy. Well, the source goes on a little further to describe this situation, saying, quote, "At sundown, the group waited for something to happen. Looking around in all directions, after what seemed to be quite a long time, the witness spoke to one of the men present who seemed to be very well informed of the situation and happenings. The man pointed to a nearby wooded hill where the Virgin had been seen recently. The man then walked towards the hill and entered the woods, quickly disappearing from the view of others present. Meanwhile, as the young man watched the man disappear behind the trees, he saw what appeared to be some type of humanoid figure, which had suddenly appeared completely immobile and silent. The strange figure resembled a thick bowling pin. It didn't seem to have any depth and was facing towards the group. It lacked any arms or legs or any discernible facial features. It was the height of a man, and it was uniformly shiny, even though it did not illuminate its surroundings. It supports itself on the ground by its bottom base. Surprised by what he was seeing, the young man was unable to move. He yelled at his family, asking if they had seen the strange figure. Apparently, his family and the others had not seen a thing. The others thought he had seen the man who had walked into the woods earlier. Still staring at the strange figure, he watched as it disappeared and then reappeared again within the wooded area, finally disappearing from sight for good. Perplexed by what he had seen, the young man immediately returned with his family to Sevilla. As they drove back on the highway, the whole family observed a flying object above the fields. On the side of the road, it looked like a glowing cloud. Even though it seemed to be moving at the same speed of the automobile and going in the same direction, it eventually fell back and was lost from sight. So yeah, now that we have that further context, it sounds a little more like something people are mistaking, because it said no arms, it almost looked like a bowling pin, but notice how it was shiny yet didn't illuminate anything.
And no facial features, right?
Well, at least from what, I guess, that story's a little interesting. I don't know if maybe there's a bit of, I wonder if there's a little bit lost in translation to English. If maybe there's a little bit of the translation from the witnesses that's lost. Do you know what I mean? I could be wrong.
You know what they might have said it had a blank expression. And that got translated to
no facial feature.
Right.
No face at all.
Know.
Right. You never know.
It's very different from the other accounts of the year where it is almost trying to look somewhat familiar, but something with no face.
Right.
Is quite a divergence, I guess, from that pattern.
Right. Exactly. Well, the summer of 68 was very, very eventful. One night in August, something very strange happened. Along the road between Betanzos and Villalba in Spain, our main witness here is a man named Pedro Pablo Barrios, who was just out driving when the ordinary night took a left turn into the bazaar. As Barrios cruised along, he suddenly noticed a luminous object near his vehicle. And this was no ordinary light in the sky. He described it as looking like, quote, two plates glued together. And we've seen similar descriptions of things in past UFO episodes, which we all know it's kind of your classic saucer-like entity. But this one had extra flair. There was a peculiar antenna sticking out of the top, which if you think about it, it's almost like a cartoon version of a flying saucer with an antenna up the top. If that wasn't strange enough, the craft began to rise into the sky, and Barrios got an even better look at it. The thing was rotating, and on each end of this saucer were two intensely bright lights. But the real moneymaker was on its underside. Barrios saw what looked like an H-shaped device with three leg-like protrusions hanging down. The luminous object seemed to defy logic and physics as it hovered and rotated, leaving Barrios in awe and probably a little freaked out. Whatever this craft was, it wasn't going to stick around long, because after a few moments of hovering there in the sky, it ascended and disappeared, leaving the shaken witness with yet another unsolved mystery in what was the wider strangeness of 1968 there in Spain. The source reads, quote, "The craft got close enough to crash into Barrios on 2 occasions. Finally, Barrios stopped and parked on the side of the road to see the object more clearly. A few seconds later, the object rose up into the air and vanished. According to the witness, during the, quote, chase, he saw several pedestrians on the road who apparently also saw the object and had to, quote, lay flat on the ground to avoid being struck by the low-flying craft. So here's an instance where other people can apparently see it, because he's seeing people literally duck to the ground to avoid getting hit by this thing. Like he said, it was almost like the thing could have crashed into him. It didn't seem like it was trying to crash into him, but it also seemed like it was chasing him, and it was clearly close enough that people were dropping to the ground to not get, like, clipped by this thing.
Yeah, it could almost be that the craft, everybody's seeing the craft because the craft is actually real.
Right.
And maybe that's the source of the projections, the entities that people have been seeing.
Right. This is something that's actually real that can maybe project maybe that antenna thing. Maybe that antenna isn't for it. Maybe it's something that it can broadcast almost to people's minds. You know?
Right. Exactly. That's definitely conceptually that makes sense.
Well, and let's say tomorrow it were to come out in the news, all these were real, and let's say they had that ability to do that. It would harken back to that idea that we're being slowly spoon-fed things. Because right now, we think a flying saucer with an antenna, that's like in Saturday morning cartoons. But if that's something, we find out, oh, well, it's actually this thing that can transmit into the minds of others. I mean, suddenly it's like you look back and you're like, oh, okay, I can see how this was preparing me, even in a cartoon form, how this was preparing me for the eventual unveiling of these things,
Right.
Maybe that's the case. Maybe this is what we think of as a cheesy old sci-fi thing, maybe there's a reason why we've known that image in our heads for so long.
That would make sense.
Well, this next story takes us to Navarra, Spain. It's August 68, once again. So literally the same month as this last one. And our central figure is a rancher by the name of Jose Piomayo. Jose's out doing, what ranchers do. He's bringing his cattle back in from the town of Balagua, accompanied by his trusty dogs. And this evening seemed ordinary until obviously it wasn't. Jose spotted two shadowy figures in the distance, approaching him. The closer they got, Jose realized that these beings seemed to be floating, hovering eerily over the ground in what can only be described as a canoe-like object. That's right, a floating, wingless craft about the size of a canoe, with these beings, like I'm guessing, sitting or standing in it, like a ghostly gondola of sort. From another dimension, perhaps. Well, Jose and his dogs, and even the cattle, reportedly could all see this thing. They were all in a state of awe and fear, and the shadowy figures continued their silent approach, their intentions completely unknown, until they eventually just disappeared, leaving behind nothing but questions. I don't know if they coasted right by them, or if they didn't even notice them, or if they were uninterested in Jose. But this is just a case of someone going by and they didn't even stop to interact with Jose. But the source says this, quote, Jose watched awestruck as the object and figures approached within 10 meters of his location. According to Jose, the occupants of this boat saw him and then made a sharp right turn and quickly disappeared into the brush. The whole time, his two dogs cowered between his legs. The two figures appeared to have been sitting inside the flying canoe, side by side. The canoe-like object was about 4 meters long. At no time did the occupants communicate or acknowledge the presence of the witness. The object flew at very low speed the whole time. And that night, Jose was unable to sleep, and the next morning returned to the site to check, but did not find anything out of the ordinary. However, his dogs refused to accompany him. One of the dogs had to be put down several days later as it developed a strange malady all over its body, something resembling tremors. And that's something also like radiation poisoning that I talked about with other cases where people will have like sunburns or sometimes some will even later in life then have like tumors grow and stuff because it's almost like a radiation thing. Now we're talking about strokes here, but it's not uncommon that there will be ill effects after an encounter with a UFO. But is this technically a UFO? This sounds like almost like a ghostly visage of two people in a canoe or something. I don't know.
It's true. I mean, we might be looking at it entirely the wrong way. Who knows?
Exactly. That very same month, in late August of 68, a local hunter named Juan Gascon del Toro was returning home in Aldaya, Valencia, Spain. Valencia's been on here quite a bit. They had spent the day out in the pasture lands, and riding his bicycle, the evening air was still and calm. Juan turned a corner and was met with a sight that would chill anyone to the bone. About 100 meters away in a nearby field, there stood an object like nothing he had seen before. This craft was unmistakably out of place. It was football-shaped and rested on 4 metallic legs, as if it had calmly settled there to observe the world below it. Almost like a kickstand is what I'm seeing in my head. Almost like a kickstand for this thing. But the craft wasn't the only thing. Lurking near the object was something even stranger. Juan's attention was drawn to several humanoid figures described as tall and wearing, quote, shiny metallic suits that would twinkle under the sunlight. These beings moved with an almost mechanical precision, going about their mysterious business. The witness, understandably rattled, kept his distance, watching from the shadows. Before long, these humanoids entered their strange craft, which then rose silently into the sky and disappeared into the ether as though they had never been there. The source describes this situation further, saying, quote, "Next to the object were some figures, which the witness first thought were children. However, as he kept approaching the object and arriving within 40 meters from it, he stopped and looked directly at the craft. The craft was about 8 meters in diameter and about 3.2 meters in height. Its base was about 60 centimeters from the ground and had landed on 3 leg-like protrusions, the same color as the object. On top of the craft, he could see what resembled a metallic iron antenna connected to a shiny protrusion on the top of the craft. He could see a door about 1.5 times 0.5 meters, on which apparently stood 2 occupants of the craft, standing on a protruding 4-rung ladder, again, the same color as the craft. The humanoids were apparently about 1.4 or 1.5 meters in height, and they were wearing helmets with dark visors, similar to the drivers. And from the area of their mouth protruded a sort of segmented rubber hose, which connected to their chests, brown in color. On the chest, they wore a wide belt. They were dressed in white diving suits. Once again, there's the diving suits. The belt seemed a little dimmer than the rest of the suit. They also wore small white boots. The humanoids were completely indifferent to the witness and just observed him without any apparent reaction. Del Toro then boarded his bicycle and took a side route, losing sight of the landed craft. The encounter lasted about 1 minute, and he heard no sounds during the encounter. So this is interesting. I mean, it does indicate suits, meaning he doesn't seem to be witnessing the physical bodies of these things, because also you notice the hose thing that comes from the mouth area down to the chest. It almost sounds like, are these like humans or humans from another dimension? Like, and maybe these suits are their version of, like, I don't know what an astronaut wears, but for interdimensional travel. I mean, at least it does seem to indicate that what we are seeing is either the suit of an extraterrestrial or a human even wearing some sort of a suit. But once again, white diving suits. White diving suits. So diving suit, think about it. It's those, especially back then, it was, remember those massive suits that had the metal like circular head with the almost like the hatch in the front you could look through, like those old diving suits. I'm not sure if that's what they're referring to, but yeah, nonetheless, it would seem that whatever these entities are, they are wearing the suits for protection of our atmosphere, our environment. Very interesting indeed. So let's talk about instances where there was more than one happening in one day in different parts of the country. On September 24th in Puerto Serrano, Cadiz, Spain, a local shepherd was tending his flock when he noticed something extraordinary. This is just the nativity story. That'd be funny. Watching his flocks by night when...
Yeah.
That'd be super. It's what it sounded like it was leading up to. A, quote, round luminous object resting in a nearby field was seen. Its beams of light were cutting through the dim countryside. The shepherd was brave but cautious and approached this strange light. That's when things got a little personal. He swore he heard voices calling out his name, beckoning him closer. But before he could investigate further, the strange craft lifted off, vanishing into the sky with an almost impossible speed, leaving him dazed and likely questioning everything he knew. But things would get even wilder, because on that very same day, across the country in Cedira, La Coruna, Spain, a woman walking along a rural road had her own close encounter. She saw a bright light approaching her, and out of that glow emerged 2 tall figures. These weren't your everyday visitors, though. The witness reported seeing, quote, lights of changing colors, shifting and flickering on the faces of these beings as they moved toward her. And if that wasn't enough to make your hair stand on end, when investigators checked out the area later, they found a burned patch in the grass, about 2 meters in diameter. So this is something happening the same day on different parts of the country. Interesting that one, it seemed to be calling his name. It's almost like, well, we associate once again that level of personal knowledge we associate with more of a supernatural thing, like an entity or a ghost would know your name. You don't think an ET, but maybe there's something, kind of like, how like in the Terminator, every now and then you'll get that shot of what he sees, and it's like it hones in on his face, says his like,
has his name and his information.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe it's something like that. If it's something either from the future, another dimension, or alien technology, they can just get a read and they're like, okay, this is,
At the very least, it could be that they've been observing and have gathered your information.
Exactly.
Just from this guy, his name's clearly John. That's what everybody calls him.
Right, exactly, right. Well, in November of 1968, businessman Francisco Donis was making his way near the Castillo de Alarcón in Cuenca, Spain, heading toward Malaga, which Malaga has come up a few times, I think, in this episode. Francisco was just minding his own business when suddenly, bam, a voice. Clear as day, but entirely telepathic, filled his mind. It instructed him to head to a specific, secluded spot nearby, and just, if it couldn't get juicy enough, Francisco couldn't fight this command. You would think, well, just don't fucking follow the voice. This thing, it's almost like it, kind of compelled him to like go where it wanted him to go and pull over and all this stuff. It's like he didn't have control of his own body. So he veered off course and followed this directive from this voice. And what awaited him there? Well, it was your typical disc-shaped object, flying craft, hovering about 3 meters above the ground next to the road. But here's where the report leaves us hanging. The details of what happened next are hazy. What we do know is that Francisco reported a profound experience, one that would stick with him for the rest of his life. But what exactly transpired? He would never say. He would never say he was taken aboard or what. But here is what the report says word for word. As he watched an opening become visible on the craft, and a retractable ladder descended to the ground, on which a human-like figure descended and approached Donis with arms outstretched in an obvious sign of peace. Speaking in perfect Spanish, the stranger informed Donis that his name was Francisco Atienza, and that he was a descendant of extraterrestrials. The stranger was totally human in appearance and wore a one-piece gray diver's suit. A long conversation ensued between this Atienza and Donis, and this conversation took place in the witness's car, meaning this thing came over and entered his vehicle, which, I mean, I guess if this thing is a human descendant of extraterrestrials, I would probably know its way around a vehicle. But this visitor told Donis that he came from a planet called Urin, spelled U-R-I-N, I'm guessing, or Urin, or Urin, I guess, yeah. Whose original inhabitants were short, large-headed humanoids. However, there existed on Urin a human colony, which lived under huge glass domes since the atmosphere of this place was toxic to humans. He further explained that life under these conditions had caused a massive sterilization among the human colony, which had more female members than males. Well, just 2 days after Francisco Donis had his strange encounter, a man named Manuel Trejo had an unnerving experience near Zafra, Extremadura, Spain. As he drove home, his car's engine suddenly began to sputter, and the headlights flickered before dimming entirely, which is very common in UFO things, especially if people are in cars. Oftentimes the cars will be brought to a stop, the encounter happens, and then as soon as it ends, the car just starts again. It's almost like these things can shut down technology or human, kind of like make it unusable until almost like an electromagnetic pulse in a way. So, before he could react, an invisible shockwave struck his vehicle with such force that it caused the car to rock side to side. Miraculously, Manuel managed to regain control, but the strange events didn't stop there. As he rounded a bend, he saw a humanoid figure standing in the middle of the road. This figure was unlike anything Manuel had ever seen before. It was dressed in a tight-fitting suit which appeared to be covered in tiny glowing lights in a pattern resembling a Christmas tree. The lights, red, green, and blue, became brighter and more intense as Manuel approached, yet he kept driving, passing the figure and watching it fade into the distance behind him. The bizarre encounter would mark the beginning of a wave of UFO sightings in the same area, many of which also involved blurred humanoid figures visible through opaque windows on the craft. These sightings sparked a flurry of local interest and led some to wonder if these mysterious events were somehow interconnected. The events would carry on through December of 1968 before trickling out and stopping completely. So, that's where the end of our tale brings us, but I wanted to, before we ended, read to you verbatim a very short article from the New York Times, posted on September 6th, titled, UFO in Sky Over Uldez Spanish Air Force, the New York Times, September 6th, 1968. The Spanish Air Force said today an unidentified flying object had eluded one of its supersonic jet fighter bombers as a rash of flying saucer reports spread from Latin America to Europe. The sighting of a bright object in the night sky yesterday over Madrid caused a traffic jam and sent the United States-built F-104 jet scrambling to find out what it was. An official Air Force announcement said the pilot climbed to an altitude of more than 50,000 feet and reported that the object was still above him when he had returned to base for fuel. The pilot of another plane flying at 36,000 feet reported seeing the same object. Air Force radar screens picked up the object and said it was flying at 90,000 feet and moving slowly. And there we have it. Pretty interesting, eh?
Very interesting. I'm so glad we were able to bring on that old-timey voice actor for that part. He was great.
I know. It cost a lot of money to get him, but...
It did.
It did.
But I think it paid off.
I think it paid off big time. And the reason why I wanted to include that is because, you know, it's not just a site meant for paranormal stories, or not that those aren't trustworthy. I wanted to find a source from the era, from a quote-unquote like news source, and that's why I wanted to include that. But yeah, once again, and here's the thing, that New York Times, what it reports sounds a lot like what we're seeing today with these Navy pilots that are seeing these objects that are almost playing with them, that seems to know their destination. It can read their, essentially whatever's in their control system, that when they pinpoint a destination on radar or whatnot, it would go there and meet them there, almost like it was playing with them, because it knew it was being pursued, and so it would circle them, or it would fly alongside them, or it would go to where their destination was, almost like it's playing with them. And this sounds kind of more like these UFO things that we're seeing today, like Commander David Fravor and all that stuff, what he saw up there. I mean, it all sounds similar. It all seems to be linked.
It does all seem to be linked. And there's too many similarities between them, not to mention the time period, the fact that they're all coinciding in this particular year. I think we brought up several of the same locations.
Yes, absolutely.
So sometimes isolated incidents are one thing, especially spread out over long distance, over a long period of time. But this seems too similar to be coincidental. And at the very least, there was a lot of weird stuff. There was some overlap in terms of similarities, and there was also some differences in a lot of these, but there were enough similarities, it seems, to tie them all together.
Right. Well, this description of diving suits.
Yeah.
Of diving suits.
That came up at least 3 times, I want to say.
Right. And I don't think they mean like scuba diving. They're talking about like deep sea diving, where you wear essentially like the tank, like you're essentially kind of immobile. It's a very like thick, it's, you know, because of the water pressure, you know. So that's interesting. There almost seems to be a uniformity in their uniforms, in that, is this like, say these are actually humans or something, or even if they are extraterrestrials, is that the necessary suit to be worn? Because maybe that means that these other things, like the Greys and stuff, maybe they are like biological droids that they send ahead to collect. And maybe the real entities or people or beings wear these like diving-like suits because that's what's necessary to actually do that traveling. That to me, more than anything, sticks out as these diving suits. Whether the thing was trying to be an angel or whatnot, some were trying to be like Grim Reapers.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the diving suits were always in the context of being near a vessel, right? Near a ship.
Oh, you're right.
And all of these other entities were in the context of people's homes, things like very personal, really removed, it seems, from the UFOs. And why would they not send in something else if they had to actually go into a person's home?
Very good point.
Or very close, just on the ground even.
How we might send a rover to Mars.
Exactly.
Or a controllable thing that goes down to like a shipwreck. And then on those occasions you got to go yourself, you would be they're near the craft and they're wearing these suits.
Right.
It's like if they're doing like when our astronauts do a spacewalk and they put on the big suit and float, like it's almost like that.
They actually have to go down there themselves.
Exactly.
Of course, they wouldn't be used to our atmosphere or all these things. And I mean, the similarities in the suits.
Exactly.
They're not even describing different suits.
Right. They're all saying diving suits. Even if the entity was trying to be an angel with wings or a this or a that, the diving suits thing was like the common denominator. Oh, Gage, man, what a fun, thought-provoking, because even the wilder stories still had little common denominators, whether it was the diving suit or the idea of burns in the ground. That to me is so fascinating. And it makes you wonder, so what is all the other stuff? Those are the common things. Then you have the things that differentiate them, whether it's the Grim Reapers or the angels with wings or all the various things that almost seem like surface level fluff. And maybe that's actually what the witnesses saw, who knows? But it seems like the common denominator are these diving suits and this sort of burn thing that comes when something is in close vicinity to these crafts. Man, I have for the last few years, I've leaned more towards interdimensional beings. Obviously, who knows? It's all hypothesis, but
it's a hypothetical that would tie so much together, though.
Absolutely right. Well, I got a list of names I wouldn't mind getting into a flying saucer with.
Oh, yeah? Who's that?
Folks, give it on up for our top-tier Patreon subscribers.
Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face via Lungfist, the Mad Marcus Hall, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid, Chris Hackworth, the Oh-So Suave, Sean Richardson, the British Bonebreaker, Bex Gray, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude, Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand, Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud, Carl Staub, the Firestarter, Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Sir of Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire, Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Buren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Zhang, the Ghoulish Gert Hankum, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Schur, the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer, the Freaky Ben Forsyth, the Barbaric Andrew Barry, the Mysterious Marcella, the Hellacious Cale Hoffman, and Pugblorb, the Poltergeist.
Well, folks, that is going to wrap us up, of course. Follow us on all of our socials. Gage, thank you again for joining me.
Absolutely. Always a good time.
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
Good night and goodbye.